Today's video is taking a look at space, or the distribution of features on the Earth's surface. When we think of geographic concept of space, it's not like going to the moon per se, but actually looking at how things are going to be arranged. To really understand and be able to explain or to describe this concept well, you should have a grasp of the terms space, distribution, and then density, concentration, and pattern, which are the ways we can use or describe distribution of various features on the Earth's surface. So, looking at space again, we talked about spatial relationships, or thinking spatially. We talked about the constant question of the why of where, and why do we care. And geographers focus on this concept, and through space they look at the actual arrangement of different features across the Earth's surface. And that can be in just about anything you can imagine, but the distribution of those particular features, or the arrangement, if you will, are an important part of understanding of a particular phenomenon or relationship that we might be addressing. So, in looking at that, the concept of space and describing the distribution of any given pattern, geographers have to look at a few different things. A good example of just looking at locally would be looking at the distribution of space in, say, North Oaks, over in the northwest east side of Pleasant Lake, and then comparing it to Shoreview, where it's just north of 96 near Hodgson, and how the use of space is drastically different. Well, how we would describe this difference is what we're going to look at right now. So when we look at the properties of distribution and how those features, in this case we're looking at homes across a given space, there's three major terms. Density, which is looking at the actual number, the frequency within a given space, and we might be talking about square miles or a residential block, or some defined area in which we literally count the frequency of which the feature occurs. On the other hand, we look at concentration, and that's going to be the extent of a feature's spread over space. In other words, how are they arranged? Are they near each other? Are they distant from each other? But when we look at a concentration, close together or a clustered concentration, you're going to see a higher frequency of this feature in one particular area of the space, whereas if it's dispersed, they're going to be more distributed throughout the actual space. So the difference between density and concentration is really pretty significant, whereas density is actually addressing how many times the feature occurs in the actual space you're looking, and concentration is where that frequency happens. Are they in that particular given space? And so in doing so, we're going to describe the pattern, and so that the geographers are interested in understanding the distribution patterns based on the density and concentration. So let's look at another example. In this case, we're just looking at a fictional residential neighborhood, and we can look at the number of times, this given the same size block, and looking at the number of homes represented in this particular neighborhood. And if you take another example of the same space, you see a different density. In other words, there's several more homes in the second example than in the first, thus creating a higher density in this case in this particular area or space. When we look at the next example, or concentration, we're seeing how are they going to be distributed. And so taking the second example from the previous slide and looking at whether or not they're clustered and dispersed, it might be difficult to tell from just one image, but if we were to take it and compare it to another example, whereas if you count the homes, there's the same number of homes represented, the density is the same, however, the concentrations are different. They are clustered in different areas of the actual space, and whereas in this case there's some shared space that's open, and each home has a smaller yard, whereas in the first example the yards are more equally distributed, but there's less open or shared green space. So how the concentration of the feature is arranged, or the arrangement of that feature is very important, and looking at those patterns. So looking at these all together, we start to see three examples where Density, you can see the first to the second or third, there's a much lower density in the first image, whereas we can start comparing the concentration of those images on how they're arranged in terms of clustered and dispersed in the patterns we see across all three. So one more quick example on a more of a national scale rather than just one residential neighborhoods. We take it to in this case we're taking it to a smaller scale, looking at on a national level, and let's look at Major League Baseball. 1952. You can see the number of teams that were represented. You recognize many of the same mascots. However, the number of teams was not only less, the density was less than what we see today, but they're far more concentrated in the Midwest and in the Northeast part of the country. Fast forward 50, 60 years, and we see a different scenario, because through the 1950s we started to see teams relocate to the West Coast as populations changed. And we also started to see through the 1970s through to the present day, we started to see additional teams and franchises being opened in other major metro areas. And so we see an increase in density across the United States, but we also see a change in a more dispersed concentration. So instead of just being right in the Northeast, we're seeing it across the country. However, you start to see some areas in terms of how the space is represented, and looking at there's a lack of a team in Montana, Colorado, in sort of the mountain region, the Mountain West, and then in the South, you see relatively limited representation. And again, a geographer would start looking at these and starting to ask questions, whether we start talking about a population, major urban centers, socioeconomic factors, things that would maybe support a major league franchise, in this case baseball. If we were to compare the two, you can see those pretty clearly between 1952 and 2012, some of the distinct changes that have happened over time. So hopefully that helps you understand space, distribution, density, concentration, and pattern. Just another one of the core concepts that we're going to be looking at and applying here in human geography.